And you're trying to give the young people something that will help them. Yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
As always, thanks for tuning into the podcast. My name is Drew Perkins, the Director of TeachThought Professional Development, and a few updates on our professional services and workshops, both on-site and online, as we shift from being in total coronavirus lockdown to more opening and gradual opening, hopefully safely. We are now offering, or at least willing, to come to your site and do face-to-face on-site workshops as we used to, well, of course with local restrictions and safety precautions as needed and as recommended. We also have all of our workshops available in online formats, so if you are a school leader and want to engage your teachers in professional learning this summer in an online format and can't do face-to-face, please reach out to learn more about that on our website, wegrowteachers.com. And we also have several offerings for online workshops for folks who might be interested in individual help, not as a school cohort group. And those are some short 1-hour sessions, sort of coaching conversations, as well as deeper, longer, extended workshops on project-based learning and inquiry and differentiated instruction that you can find more information on at wegrowteachers.com/online workshops. So hopefully those things are helpful. We have some other things planned and soon to be released, so stay tuned, but please feel free to reach out with any questions that you might have. My email is drew@teachthought.com. In this podcast episode, I spoke with Scott Barry Kaufman, who was on the podcast a couple years ago, and we talked then about his book, Ungifted. He has a new book out called Transcend, the new Science of Self-Actualization, in which he provides an update and somewhat of a redefinition of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I wanted to have Scott back on the podcast to talk about this because in the end, this is really about the unlocking of human potential, which should be of utmost interest for educators. And I think he does a great job. The book is really, really good. One note about the conversation, I will say, is that I probably should have started the conversation by talking about the bigger picture and macro level kinds of things and then narrowed it. Instead, because I was so interested as a son of a psychologist and teacher and former teacher of psychology, I chose to kind of walk through the various pieces of the book and the notes that I had made. So my apologies if the conversation at all feels disjointed. Any blame for that should squarely be laid at my feet, not Scott's. And I certainly recommend that you look into his work, this book, and hope you enjoy the podcast. Scott, welcome to the podcast. Happy to have you back on. We're going to talk about Scott's book, Transcend, the new Science of Self-Actualization, and I'm super, super excited because this is right in my wheelhouse as a former teacher and psychologist and the son of a psychologist and teacher. So this is certainly a book that I would recommend and enjoy and have lots of notes. So I'm looking forward to this conversation, but I want to give you a chance to tell our listeners a bit more about yourself. You've been on the podcast, but it's been a while, and educators may not be, but should be, familiar with your work. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, thanks, Drew. Well, I started off as a cognitive scientist investigating human intelligence and IQ testing and the cognition of creativity. And in my most recent version of my life, I've been really interested in self-actualization and what it means to live a fulfilled life where not only our basic needs are met, but our higher needs are met. And its applications to education as well as more broadly society and businesses. So now I kind of identify as a humanistic psychologist.
Right. And that's a good place, I think, for us to start our conversation, because when we talk about education, and I'm going to keep trying to pull what you and I talk about back into thinking about teaching and learning in education, because I think it's highly relevant in lots of ways, but the ways in which people describe education, one of the things that people might say about the way that we talk about education is progressive, and I'm maybe a little bit uncomfortable with that term, and I think humanistic is maybe a better way to think about, or a term to use for how we at TeachThought think about education. But when you sort of unpack, or what's your elevator speech for humanistic psychology?
Oh, my elevator speech. Well, it's really an investigation of what the whole integrated human looks like, not just parts of us, but how can we have great inner peace and become the best we possibly can be for that sacred, unique part of ourselves that no one else has. You know, how can we realize that and impact in a positive way the world at large with that? So it really is all about actualization of potential, but also integration of our dark side, of our fears or anxieties, and elucidating what the lived experiential vital life looks like for people.
Yeah, and in education, maybe some.
Would you get off the elevator if I said that?
Not if I knew who I was on the elevator with.
Okay.
But in education, that's pretty good. In education, we might call that, or it's often called, or something similar to like whole child education and growth mindset, which I know you mentioned in the book as well. But I think there's some really important lessons and things to think about here. And,
hey, Drew?
Yeah.
I actually don't mention growth mindset in the book. Only in a footnote.
Only in a footnote. Okay.
I mentioned growth motivation.
Growth motivation. Okay.
Which is different. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess maybe I highlighted the footnote.
Growth part. Or even, just the fact growth.
Yeah.
It's very easy to because people are so in the education world are so ensconced in the growth mindset phrase that I think that anything that has the word growth in it, they just immediately translate into that. But actually this is very important to me, which is why I pointed it out.
Okay.
Because Maslow's notion of growth motivation is not quite the same as modern day notions of growth mindset.
Right. And growth mindset has been, I don't know, sort of criticized in the educational world and some of the literature around it, and I think it's been misinterpreted, and that's maybe for a different conversation. So the work that you did in writing this book was to sort of redefine and update Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and there's also a similar, I think, a similar model that gets misused and probably needs to be updated as well in education, called Bloom's taxonomy. But and maybe that's a blog post for me at a later date. But I find it, an interesting parallel that we have these kinds of misinterpretations that, as you point out, the hierarchy is not something to be viewed as a triangle to be, ascending and that kind of piece. So the pieces that you pull out, I think, are really fascinating. And then going towards transcendence and the pieces like one of the first things that struck me and thinking about the meaning and the distinctions of meaning and how we create meaning in education and teaching and learning. And if you don't mind sort of unpacking them a little bit, the coherence, purpose, and mattering. And I think those distinctions are really interesting in a classroom setting of not just that kids matter, because that is certainly important, but there's also a purpose and a coherence that is part of that equation.
Yeah, for sure. Well, psychologists have tried to untangle various meanings of the word meaning itself. And one of those meanings of the word meaning is just simply having coherence in your environment, that your environment makes sense. Things in your immediate, in school or with your friends or with your family, there's some predictability there. There's just not complete chaos and harshness and unpredictability. But there's another sense of meaning. That's not all we want in life. We also want a sense of purpose. That's another form of meaning. We want to have a goal that energizes us, that really makes us feel alive and pulls us into the future in some way, calls us. We feel like we're called into the future. And then there's also another form which doesn't get talked about as much in the literature, and sometimes it's called existential meaning. And that's a form of meaning which is my life's worth living. Some people may live in an environment that makes sense. They even feel a goal, higher level goal, but they don't even really feel like their life is really worth it. So, yeah, it's there's different forms of meaning.
Yeah, and we think about social emotional learning, and again, it's kind of getting back to some of that whole child piece. And one of the things that you talk about in the book that I think is a really important piece is this idea or the perception of children or some children that the world is a dangerous place, and that we need to be really sort of scared of things, and that creates a real dynamic. And so the social-emotional learning space and sort of trauma-informed teaching or safe spaces and trigger warnings and microaggressions, how do you think about those kinds of social-emotional pieces as it pertains perhaps to how students might perform or need to be challenged in classrooms?
What a lofty question. Well, it's a constant balance, the need for safety and the need for growth. We can't grow to our full height unless we feel safe and secure in our basic needs. And I include in my basic needs, I include the need for security, the need for safety, the needs for connection, some level of connection, and the need for self-esteem. Those are important needs that when they're severely deprived, rightfully so, people go into this deprivation motivation, where everything looks like what is they're deprived of to them. So if you're and everyone can recognize this. I don't think we need to separate those people from us. Any one of us, if we're chronically hungry, everything will look like a hamburger to us, like it is just, or if we're a vegetarian, whatever, broccoli, that's all we care about. Have you ever really had to pee during a concert? Like suddenly that concert isn't as beautiful anymore.
Right.
And let's say it's another hour before the intermission.
Shifts your priorities.
Yeah, it shifts your priorities. You could be listening to the most beautiful sonata, and if you have an hour, you have to be stuck there and you have to go emergency level. That's not going to really allow you to appreciate the beauty of the music as fully as if you weren't so deprived of a restroom at that moment. But that's just one example, because I use these examples just so we can all rally around the lower order examples, and then we can try to build up to the more higher order examples, like even esteem or pride. If students are chronically deprived of feeling a sense of self-worth, and a lot of kids in special ed really feel that way. So this is not a theoretical example. If they feel like there's constantly low expectations for them, a lot of ways they'll act may seem fragile, but is actually quite predictable and understandable considering human nature, and quite reasonable. Now, you used some words that are used in political fights, like safe spaces and all that. I try to. I'm a colleague and a great admirer of Jonathan Haidt's work, who wrote The Coddling of the American Mind, and like him, I try to stay apolitical in my discussions, because we're both interested in understanding the different sides rather than picking a side. And as a social scientist in public, I'm very interested in understanding all the different perspectives on the table. I think what you're really getting at there is something important, which is how do you strike that right balance? And I think there is a lot of there is such a thing as coddling, first of all. So we can have students in special ed, students who are severely lacking in something, and have the urge as a parent or a teacher to just do everything for them, but that's not going to be helpful. We can want to avoid exposure to things, remove everything possible that might quote trigger them, but that's not going to be helpful for their development and growth. They're going to get out of school someday, and they're not going to be in a world where everyone's going to care so much about making sure they avoid everything. And if you want your child to live, or your student to live a full life someday, you're doing them a great disservice.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I agree too. And I've had Jonathan on the podcast, and I'm a fan of his work and that book as well. And as a teacher, I think it's important to find that sort of edge of productive struggle, right? Which is both cognitively but also socially. Like what provides them just enough challenge that it's interesting, and hopefully content-wise it's interesting, but also socially it's engaging and supportive and all of those things. But it also isn't so challenging or so difficult that it makes them shut down and we lose them. So that's sort of the challenge there.
Yeah.
One of the quotes that you have in the later part of the book that is interesting is imagine if schools weren't only a place to learn standardized academic material, but were also places full of wonder, awe, and self-actualization, as well as hope for humanity, which of course sounds like humanistic education. And that gets to the question for me, and I believe I agree with that in large part, but I also think there's a devil's advocate position that has some value to think about. All right, what is the role of knowledge, and it certainly doesn't discount knowledge, but there's one of the criticisms that I think is valid of sort of progressive or maybe humanistic education is that it sort of places cognitive or behavioral engagement ahead of really important pieces of knowledge that one must have to be successful in this world. And that's certainly arguable. And so I guess the question is what knowledge is important and vital, or is there a set of knowledge that's important and vital for every kid to have, and versus, sort of the how are these kids smart versus how smart are these kids sort of questioning. And I don't know how you think about that in terms of the role of knowledge and even inquiry in teaching and learning or thinking.
Yeah, there's a lot there. What was the single question?
Yeah, so in terms of the ways in which we might structure the teaching and learning of, let's say, K-12 education, do you have a sense of there is a set of knowledge that is vital for all kids to come away with, or is it more important, would you place more value on kids pursuing their interests and finding their sort of niche?
Yeah, self-actualization versus knowledge actualization, general knowledge actualization.
Yeah, perhaps, yeah.
Yeah, perhaps. Well, I mean, certainly K through 8, there's a set of core curriculum that seems very sensible for students to learn. I'm not a fan of complete chaos and free for all from K on. But I think there becomes a point even in high school where so much of it is unnecessary, and when students have clear talents and strengths that are dwindling, I mean, why does it have to wait? Why do they have to wait to start their lives until they're even out of college? So I think that, again, it's like a balance. I could potentially be a boring interviewer because I feel like everything is about balance. I'm very Zen Buddhist in my philosophy about things. I wouldn't say that we need a 100% self-actualization model that ignores knowledge, but I also wouldn't say that knowledge is everything. There's a lot of time wasted in school. This is something I'm passionate about. especially with kids who clearly can handle work 3, 4, 5 grade levels above their peers, and not giving them, a lot of gifted education programs get their funding cut, and it's seen as elitist when, I see talent fulfillment as a basic need, and when students are capable of and ready to engage in particular material and they are denied access to it, I see that as denying them oxygen or food. And I don't think a lot of educators see it that way, but I see it that way, and I've been a champion of that way of thinking for a decade or so.
It's interesting to see some of the results of the pandemic and what's happening because of that the AP testing and College Board testing is I guess in some peril, at least short term, and I'm not sure how I feel about that. I think I'm not a big fan of standardized tests and have often messaged against them just because I think the effect that it has on the ways in which teachers focus their work just so heavily on preparing for tests and that kind of thing, I think is counter to a more wide-ranging and liberal arts kind of education and critical thinking and inquiry. Yeah. But is there a real place for standardized tests that make a lot of sense? I mean, I know you've done a lot of work in IQ tests, which is some sort of a standardized test. Is a different ball game there.
Different, but very highly correlated.
Yeah.
IQ tests are correlated extremely highly with standardized test performance. So we've, in a lot of ways, created a school system that draws out a particular general intelligence and kids who have a very high capacity to learn complex information and abstract information on the spot and hold that in their working memory are at an advantage in that kind of environment. Mm-hmm. And one could argue their advantage in life as well. An IQ researcher would make that point. A particular IQ researcher may make that point, and they wouldn't be wrong. But it's a tricky territory because the question you have to ask with all these sorts of things is what's the replacement? If we get rid of all standardization, then things start to become more subjective, and learning is up to the teacher and whether the teacher likes you. But on the other hand, it's been shown that GPA is a better predictor of lots of things in the child's future than standardized test scores, because with GPA you can bring out what are called non-cognitive characteristics. Mm-hmm. So they're not so reliant on general intelligence. A student's conscientiousness and passion and grit and conscientiousness or excitement for material, all that is captured more in a teacher's evaluation than a standardized test score can pick up about a human. The question I ask myself a lot when I think about these issues is, what do we want to know about a human? Do we only care about their ability to learn, their capacity to learn quickly and broadly? Is that what we care about? If we do, I mean, standardized tests, it's more objective, it's fair. It has a place for assessing learning across different schools and different students and metrics in a school system. But also, there's something to be said from that the teacher evaluation and the more personal human connection. But you also want to make sure that certain students aren't discriminated when things become more subjective. Mm-hmm. There's some very interesting research showing that, and I'm a fan of universal screening. If you do universal screening, it's much fairer for minority students. And paradoxically, SAT scores do a favor. I mean, as much as they're maligned for showing differences between different racial groups, actually SAT scores is one of our best bets of picking up the gifted minority student in a fair and objective manner, as opposed to using subjective methods to discriminate. So I think that that's not recognized that much among educators.
Any particular reason why you think that happens?
Well, subjectively, people might have all sorts of implicit or explicit biases against what a gifted student would look like. And maybe even some minorities, their behavior could be exactly the same as a Caucasian middle class student, but the minority, it's interpreted as bad behavior. They're being creative, but no, send them to detention. They're acting out again. Whereas they move the Caucasian student to the front of the gifted line. I mean, you look in gifted education, we're talking cross-state wide differences in ethnicities, and a lot of acceptance into these programs are subjective rating scales and various things. You do actually find objectively that when you do universal screening, you narrow the gap. So that's hard data, and you can't. When you have hard data, you can't just take your ideology and say that's more important than the data.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I don't disagree. It certainly is an interesting. One of the things that we do a lot of work in is inquiry and building students' ability to ask questions, not just sort of sit as consumers.
Love that.
And really drive their own learning. And one of the things that is certainly a dynamic at play in that is a cultural phenomenon that certain cultures actually are told by their parents and elders and those close to them that they shouldn't ask questions in class because it might be seen as, some act of defiance or questioning authority, that kind of thing, which is obviously detrimental to that kind of a culture. And I would think that any teacher who is talk about a mindset of like an inquiry mindset where you're really fostering questions and using questions as a way to unpack learning and get to critical thinking, that those kinds of teachers wouldn't see that kind of behavior as threatening, but more authoritarian, draconian kind of teachers. And this gets to, I think, one of the central themes, one of the things that I think is a real issue with just people in general is the idea of insecurity. And if you're not secure in yourself as a teacher, then questions from students, just like questions from peers in general life, can be seen as a threat and seen as an attack. So how does, I guess, I'm curious, I think I have a sense of it, but I'd like to hear in your words, like, how do you feel about the role of insecurity in how people's behavior manifests in so many different ways?
Well, I was talking earlier about when we're in our deprivation motivation mindset versus growth motivation mindset. It pervades our entire being, learning. I think we underestimate that, when students are chronically hungry and, people go into low SES schools and they say, look at these low achieving students, look how stupid they are. That's so misguided. Such a fundamental misunderstanding about what that means and a lack of empathy for what it must be like for those students for their deprivations and insecurities to pervade everything they're doing. Mm-hmm. I personally saw that up close as a kid in special ed growing up with an auditory disability. When there were such low expectations for me, it pervaded everything I did in my life. And once I took myself out and started to get some I'll save it respect because I think a lot of students, all they want is pride, healthy pride in what they were doing. Like I joined the school orchestra and I started to feel good about myself for the first time. It changed everything and it made me more motivated to want to learn. So I saw very up close just how malleable that can be.
Yeah, I taught special ed and behavior emotional disorder, and you can just feel the insecurity that those kids have and the way that they lash out as a defense mechanism. And it just strikes me, and I think about our political polarization and the ways in which people react to one another, and it strikes me that insecurity is such a a root of all of that, or much of that, because it feels like people are so insecure in their positions and what they know and what they don't know, and truth is harder than ever to really figure out. And just in general adult to adult relationships, thinking about how hard it is to have a healthy relationship with people who are insecure. And you're talking about from the book, I'm just looking at a piece that I highlighted, the corrosive connections are like black holes. They absorb all of the light in the system and give back nothing in return. And it's just so hard to be in a peer-to-peer relationship with somebody who's insecure. And I mean, can somebody who is not terribly insecure have a high quality relationship with somebody who's highly insecure?
Oh, absolutely. People who are more secure tend to have a higher form of love, be love, where they can admire the person for who they am, separate from who you are. And who they are doesn't depend on who you are. I think we can try to really attempt to cultivate this higher form of love, this level of be love for the being of others, and we can do that when we are more secure, and we can even recognize the imperfections in others and acknowledge we have those imperfections in ourselves. I mean, we're all imperfect beings.
Sure.
There's no such thing as a purely secure person.
Right.
And we can help others who, in fact, helping others, especially those who are insecure, is one of the greatest routes to personal well-being one could have.
Yeah. So when we think about that as a teacher, student, or a parent-child relationship, the children are, one would think, usually less secure. I have 2 daughters now who are officially in middle school as of last week, and that's like perhaps the most insecure time in anybody's life, as they're trying to figure out who they are. And so in that sense, in that relationship, I'm trying to stand in as a proxy in some cases for that insecurity, and support them, and sort of scaffold that support in ways that help them figure out who they are, and experience all of the things that you have to experience to really become more secure. You have to make mistakes and all of that. But then as you grow older, the peer-to-peer relationships, that can be tremendously exhausting.
Oh, yeah. Well, what do you mean? And how can they be exhausting?
Well, like you said, so going back to that quote, the corrosive connections are like black holes, like the sort of need for that constant support and meaning, adding value or helping them feel like they are better than they feel like they are, that kind of thing.
Yeah. That quote was within the context of discussing high quality relationships. Mm-hmm. And the importance of cultivating high quality relationships in your lives. There are certainly people in our lives that feel like they suck our energy away, and those who feel like give us an energy force when we're talking to them. And that we feel like there's a real mutuality. There's a real sense of relatedness. So that was within that context. I mean, you're certainly right. It can be exhausting interacting with someone who constantly feels like they're trying to exploit you or doesn't care about your well-being. But yeah, I mean, I'm not sure exactly. You're talking about within a school context?
Yeah, well, it's just the observation of sort of stepping in, and the necessity of, or the need for, a teacher to sort of play some of that role, and then gradually provide more autonomy. And one of the things that we talk about lots is autonomy, giving students autonomy, which is part of the purpose and meaning that occurs in a learning situation, and gradually increasing that level of autonomy. But to be able to do that, you have to have some increasing level of security, as well as ability to handle, the differing situations that might be coming in front of them, the challenges in front of them. So some of those are cognitive and academic, and some of them are social. And it just, it wasn't a question necessarily. It was just it just strikes me as such an important piece, the insecurity and the building of security and confidence in students and young people, because I feel like one of my major roles, if not the biggest job I have in raising my daughters, is to help them be confident and secure in who they are, so that they can recognize they have faults, and all of the things that go along with that, and the necessity or the importance of teachers being able to do that. Are there any particular ways, sort of like strategies or things that you've come across in research that either parents or teachers, ways in which they can build that confidence?
When you're a teacher, you're in the great position to try to foster high quality relationships in your classroom. And I think that a lot of teachers get into their own deprivation mode and need to realize that they don't need to be dragged down into that and then shift to, well, we need to make sure that I just keep the peace in the classroom. I think there's also a sense which you can try to foster among students who might not even like each other, a sort of sense of respect or mutuality for each other's different viewpoints and for different ways of being. I really do recommend teachers look at the research on high quality connections and the different features of it, and really try to listen to students who with different perspectives, and try to see what things are in common between students that they can emphasize, as opposed to always emphasizing the discord.
Mm-hmm. One of the examples that you used in the book, and I'd seen the documentary on the free soloing climber, his last name is
isn't that great?
Honnold. Yeah, that documentary was absolutely stunning and crazy and amazing. For those of you who are not familiar with it, he free solo climbs without ropes or anything. What is it? I know it's in California. Do you remember the name of the sheer cliff that he climbs? I don't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but
El Capitan?
Is El Capitan? I think so, yeah. I mean, just to watch it, and the cinematography is amazing. His story is amazing.
It's scary.
Yeah, it's an interesting example, and one of the things that we focus on with teachers in the work that we do is valuing the process over the product. And cool. It feels like that testing and accountability has placed such a high emphasis on product and, sort of the summative assessment pieces, but that the process is really, really valuable as well, and tells us as teachers a lot about the learning that is happening. So can you kind of unpack that sort of problem-focused coping strategy and that story a little bit?
What's cool about him is that he's a good example of how we can train ourselves to overcome our default fear response when there is uncertainty. A lot of us, most of us, have that as our default. If there's a great uncertainty, unpredictability, we go into a high alert, high fear. And what Honnold was able to show is that with preparation, as much preparation as possible, we can start to really lower that fear response. And with shifting our spirit to more of a sense of exploration and curiosity, we can overcome that fear response. When he said that when he started out, and I don't know how much that's true, but he said when he started out, he had a lot of fear for even the small climbs he did. And then gradually over time, that fear response got smaller and smaller. And researchers did look in his brain and show that his amygdala functioning, the part of the brain that processes the significance of emotional information, was reduced. The response was reduced in response to grotesque pictures that most of us, it would show an automatic response. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that means that he has learned to become a psychopath. because you also see that reduced response in psychopaths. I think that it means that he has really trained these more higher level prefrontal circuits that are necessary for overcoming and inhibiting our default responses that want to come into our consciousness from our subcortical structures. And like the amygdala is a more subcortical structure than the prefrontal cortex. So he's just trained himself so hard through his process, like you said, the process. So I'm glad that you said that, as opposed to thinking and fearing the outcome. Everything is a step-by-step process to him. So when he knows he has to climb El Capitan without a rope. I mean, just the thought of that with me, I shudder. But he doesn't think of the goal. He doesn't think like he's like, all I need to do is survive this step, then this step, then I go up to this step, then that step, and it all turns into the outcome. But each process he's practiced so methodically that he doesn't need to fear it. If you don't fear any of the individual components, you can really accomplish great things.
Yeah, I was listening to a podcast with Sam Harris, and I think you're going to be on his podcast sometime soon, right?
This Wednesday, I'm recording with him.
Okay, cool. And he had somebody on who was talking about the different sort of setting of goals, and it reminded me of this free climber. Was the idea of, instead of becoming, I think he said, becoming a marathoner or finishing a marathoner, but thinking of himself as a runner. So projecting your future self as a runner, not as somebody who has finished a marathon. And I found that to be a really interesting distinction, because I run and I'm very, very competitive, but I don't find myself at all compelled to run in any sort of competitive, 5K or anything like that. But I think of myself as a runner, and it strikes me as an important distinction. I don't know if you'd heard that podcast.
Who was it with?
I want to say the guy's name's James Clear, but I'm not remembering.
Oh, probably, yeah. It probably was James Clear. I know he was on that podcast recently, and that sounds like something James Clear would say.
Yeah.
the habit guy.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm right on with that.
Yeah, I mean, so I wonder how what are the implications of that as we think about helping students, and do we try to help them think about themselves as graduates or as learners? Or does that even matter?
I think the real key insight there is how do you integrate something into the core of your identity? The distinction between harmonious and obsessive passion is relevant here, because Robert Vallerand has looked at this distinction. First of all, it is helpful if you want to really learn something and accomplish something to turn it to, I have to write this essay, into, I'm a writer. That's just what I do. That's part of my identity. But then further, how you identify it into your identity and into the core of your identity is important. Are you harmoniously passionate about what you're doing, in the sense that you really love what you're doing, and in the sense that it makes you feel good about yourself, it doesn't conflict with other areas of your life? Or are you obsessively passionate about what you're doing, in the sense it does take you away from other areas of your life, and you feel a compulsive need to engage in it? And but regardless of the flavor, and I think the flavor is important, reframing things as, I'm a runner. I mean, I wasn't a runner 3 weeks ago, but I decided during this pandemic, I'm going to get fit. If I can do anything, I feel helpless over here sometimes. If I can do something, I'm going to get fit, and I'm going to just take up running as a hobby. And I bought like Under Armour running shoes, because I'm like, what would a runner do? They would buy good shoes. And so I bought Under Armour, these bright red shoes that signal, I'm a Under Armour runner. And it motivates me, and I look forward to running later today after a few podcasts I have this morning. And and in my new shoes, because now I'm a runner. Now it's just a shift in my identity. It's something that I do now, and hopefully someday the skills will back it up, but not yet for sure.
How far are you going?
Well, I try to do a couple miles a day, and I've always been more of a sprinter anyway.
Okay.
But I'm really trying to increase my speed, and also I've been told a lot about the huge benefits of quick bursts, of interval training.
Yeah.
And so I've been practicing interval training and hoping that'll help me and my health.
There you go.
And wellness.
Well, so the future image of themselves was mentioned in the service of creativity, and I was wondering, kind of to that point, is that just limited to creativity? And it would seem that it isn't, because it's, you start to develop this image of yourself, which is all part of the self-actualization process, and you're talking about there's a chart here about motivational quality continuum, and you're talking about having less learning when there's lack of motivation, and the intrinsic motivator, and having that intrinsic motivation leading to more deeper learning, and it's such an important piece. The idea that we're doing the work that we're doing in schools because it's important to the students, not just to the adults, and I think that's something that's so easy to overlook, and the equation. And when you went, I know a little bit about your journey in school, and how did your intrinsic motivation shift over the years as you made that journey from special education into more regular education, and how did that sort of parallel with your journey to self-actualization?
There was a huge shift in intrinsic motivation for academics once I took myself out of special ed in 9th grade. Before that, I wasn't motivated by academics at all, extrinsically or intrinsically. In fact, I wonder if the greatest thing for me was becoming extrinsically motivated by my academics. Now I'm really trying to think of this through, because I really was passionate about showing my school that I wasn't stupid. I think that was my motivation when I got out of special ed in 9th grade. It was like, I was fascinated by learning, and I wanted to know what I was capable of. I never tested my limits at all, so I was curious if I could learn at all. But there was a radical shift in my passion, and whether or not it was harmonious or obsessive, I don't. Maybe it was a mix, a balanced mix of the two when I got out of special ed in 9th grade. But my journey of self-actualization really took hold in college when I discovered the writings of Robert Sternberg and his work on intelligence and redefining intelligence. And I felt within me this was a purpose of mine in life, and I really wanted to study intelligence and study with him at Yale. And I worked very, very hard to get into the PhD program at Yale, so I could work with him and do a dissertation on intelligence. It was something that meant a lot to me. That journey of self-actualization, I think, started in college, but in high school, a lot of it, I think, was there was some ego-driven aspects there, if I may be honest.
Interesting. So let's kind of zoom back out to the bigger picture of how you have redefined and sort of reset Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And if you don't mind, kind of give us the short version and of how you would describe, or how you do describe, Maslow's hierarchy, and then the difference in your approach or the way that you have restructured it in some ways.
Oh, sure. Well, the original Maslow's hierarchy of needs was in the shape of a pyramid. It's often how it's depicted, as though you have basic physiological needs that are really important at the base of the pyramid, which are foundational. like food, safety, shelter, water. And then above that, you have physiological needs. You have physiological needs at the bottom, and then above that, you have safety needs. And then above safety needs, you have connection and belonging needs. And then above that, you have esteem needs, esteem from others as well as self-esteem. And then often the two are related to each other very strongly. And then above that is self-actualization at the tip of this pyramid. And what was interesting to me is that when I was looking through Maslow's writings, I realized he never actually drew a pyramid to represent his hierarchy of needs. And yeah, I thought that was just really interesting. And his writings, he made it very clear that we can target multiple needs simultaneously. And not only that, but life is always this 2-step forward, 1 step back dynamic, where we're constantly striving for higher levels of integration, but we don't ignore our lower needs. We don't ignore them. It's not like life's a video game, where we reach a certain level and then we unlock the level above it, right? So there was a much more rich, nuanced theory when I looked into the writings of Maslow, and also I realized his focus was on the distinction between security and growth. That was really his fundamental distinction, was between security and growth. And I think a sailboat is a better metaphor for what he was actually trying to get at. Because when you're on a sailboat, you have a base of the ship. It needs to be secure before you can move anywhere. And I include the needs for safety, the needs for connection, the needs for self-esteem as part of that ship. But if we are going to want to move anywhere, we need to eventually open our sail and be vulnerable to the unknown of the ocean, the waves that could come crashing down on us at any time. At a certain point, when we're motivated by growth, by purpose, by direction that we're moving in, by love for others, the humanitarian concerns, and by exploration, the spirit of exploration, we act and we move forward despite the unknown. And I just really think that the sailboat metaphor captures that dynamic human developmental process, and that connection between security and growth better than a static pyramid. Does that make sense to you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it really resonated with me because I've always thought similarly, and I'm sure I'm not alone in this, that you don't just go step by step up this sort of ladder, that it's a sort of mucky mess of you're taking steps forward, as you said, and backwards, and you're moving, and you're trying to reach self-actualization as an ideal, but it's really not something. It's not like you get there at the top of a mountain and say, well, I've achieved it and check that off my list, right? It's a constant process of trying to be more self-actualized, and so it makes absolute sense. And so you've got exploration, love, and purpose in the growth areas, and then you top it off with transcendence, which is icing on the cake of it's not really about self-actualization; it's about transcending that. So how do you I guess tell the listeners a little bit, how do you define transcendence? Because that's a pretty heavy word.
It is a heavy word. I don't view transcendence as being above others. I really view it as really great connectedness with others and the rest of humanity, almost in the most extreme, like when you do an LSD trip. There's a sense of oneness with you and the world. You have transcended your ego, but not necessarily yourself. You haven't completely risen above your basic needs. Those needs are still there, but your self-focus is not so great. You can dial down the ego enough where you witness the beauty around you and you witness the beauty of others, even if they don't have any utility value for you. I don't think people realize just how often when they encounter others, they're subconsciously or consciously calculating, this person's age, this demographic, why would I want to talk to them? But when we reach this level of transcendence, the 80-year-old grandmother is just as interesting to us to hear about their life story and what are they all about than, someone your own age who might be a new friend.
Mm-hmm. A question I've posed to some friends recently that I've found an interesting discussion topic is if you could live to, let's say, 1,000 years old or some crazy high number, given that you were physically healthy and quality of life kinds of physical pieces were in place, that would you do that, or would you prefer to live until 100 at most or something like that? And I think about my deathbed, assuming that all things are it's not a tragic accident or something like that. I think I will be most sad about dying because of all of the things that I will be missing in life. Because even the joy of life and the sorrows of life are all amazing, and I'm wondering how do you think about that?
Sam. Great attitude.
Would you want to live to 1,000?
Yes, I think.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I want to or not, but I don't know that I can't categorically say no.
There was a point where one time I was thinking about getting cryogenically preserved because I read an article from the Wait But Why, Tim Urban. He has a beautiful, fascinating, elucidating thread on that because I think he decided to go through with it. There was a phase I went through there because I resonated with what Tim said in his post, which is I'm just so fascinated with the world. I want to witness the world for as long as possible.
Right.
And I want to be conscious of it all. And I want to write about it. That's what he's a writer. So I really resonated with that. But, as I get older, I don't know, interestingly enough, when the ego dissolves, and I've been really trying to work on that, my fear of death lessens as well. Mm-hmm. These things work with each other. So the more we meditate, the more that we do transcendence practices, the less we fear death. And almost it doesn't matter when. If it's 1,000 years from now, 5,000 years from now, you start to accept that whenever it is, it's still going to happen. You can keep putting it off, but it's going to happen. So just eventually all the stars in the whole universe will die out.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking trillions of years from now, but
let's hope.
Let's hope it's trillions of years from now. I had Sean Carroll, the physicist, on my podcast where we discussed from a physics perspective the truth about is there God, is there life after death, all these age-old questions, and he gave me 99% probabilities on lots of these answers, and I was like, wow. I was like, holy
it's pretty
cow.
good.
So people, if they're interested, they can listen to my my chat when Sean Carroll was on my podcast, not the one where he interviewed me recently, but before that when I interviewed him on my podcast. But anyway, the point is, the best way to live one's life is not to be so concerned with that, but to just be as mindful as you can of the moments you do have. And I know that I'm not the first one to say that. Pick up the power of now,
right?
or the Buddha. A lot of people have been saying that, but there is a real truth there. A real truth to recognizing the impermanence of everything, and that recognition of the impermanence of everything is what allows you, enables you to cherish the moment. Without that impermanence, if we did live forever, that would be a horrible thing.
Yeah, there's the idea or the use of mindfulness and living in the moment is certainly really, really important, and helping students do that in being thoughtful. Meditation is a part of that as well. And I read a quote, and I think I tweeted it. It was something like, people say the greatest gift you can give somebody is the gift of giving them your time, but they said, actually, it's giving them your attention. And it may have been, actually, if I'm remembering right, it was on the Sam Harris podcast, which I know he talks a lot about mindfulness and meditation, but that idea of being attentive to the moment, whether it's yourself or somebody else, and that's just it's a really important piece. So I'm mindful of time, and I want to make sure that folks have a way to find you. The book is certainly about human potential, and any teacher and educator should be interested in that. I'd recommend the book. It's Transcend, the New Science of Self-Actualization, but you also have the psychology podcast, so I want to make sure you have a chance to share links and all those kinds of things.
Thank you. Well, it really, so much is at scottbarrykaufman.com. So much of my work is there. Can be found there in my podcast, the Psychology Podcast. You can find links there, but you can also subscribe to it on iTunes. I'm on Instagram at Scott Barry Kaufman. You put the @ sign, whatever. You know what I'm talking about. Instagram people know what's up. Let's see. Email info@scottbarrykaufman.com. Drop me a line. Say hi. Just feel real blessed to be on your show twice. I know I don't take it for granted. I don't think you invite everyone to be on twice, right? So I must have said something good the first time.
I appreciate your work. The first book was Ungifted, and this one is certainly worth a read as well. And you've also got some great pieces out that are journal pieces, and you're on Twitter, and your Twitter feed is definitely worth following as well. So
Thank you. Thank you.
Scott, thanks for the time, and thanks for the good work.
Thank you. All the best to you.
That'll do it for today's podcast episode. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to review us and share us on your network so we can grow our audience to better meet your needs. Also, don't forget to find us on our websites, teachthought.com and wegrowteachers.com, as well as our various social media outlets.